Rain lashed against the carriage glass, blurring the silhouette of the town that had just sold her. 16, traded for a ledger of bad debts. Cora gripped her knees, awaiting the brute who bought her. What Thomas Abernathy did next wouldn't just break tradition, it would unravel them all. 16 years of life neatly tallied and exchanged for £400 of promissory notes. Cora sat rigid in the back of the hired brougham, her spine refusing to touch the tufted leather. Stiff black bombazine scratched furiously at her collarbone. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and rot. It was her late mother's dress, hastily taken in by a trembling aunt who had spent the entire morning avoiding Cora's eyes. Outside, the sky was the color of a bruised plum. Rain turned the rutted streets of Oakhaven into a thick, sucking mire. The carriage lurched over a deep pothole. Cora's teeth clicked together violently. She tasted a faint tang of copper on her tongue. Beside her, Thomas Abernathy didn't flinch. He just kept his gaze fixed on the gray slop sliding past the window. He was 32, a man built like a heavy iron stove, burdened with the wealth of 3 thriving timber mills. His broadcloth coat pulled too tightly across his wide, sloping shoulders. His hands rested on his knees, massive things, knuckles scarred and permanently embedded with the shadow of wood sap and machine grease. Oakhaven fed on gossip the way starving dogs fought over butchered scraps. They called Thomas a brute, a solitary, unpolished fixture of the lower valley who had finally decided to buy himself a desperate gentleman's daughter because no respectable woman of age would tolerate his crude silences. Cora gripped her hands in her lap until her joints ached. She braced herself. She waited for the heavy weight of his palm on her thigh, a proprietary leer, some awful, clumsy attempt at claiming the property he had just acquired at the altar of St. Jude's. Instead, Thomas leaned in the opposite direction. He gave her a wide berth on the bench, leaving a distinct foot of cold space between them. He smelled of lye soap, damp wool, and cold rain. Not whiskey, not the sharp sting of imported cigars her father favored. Just sheer, unadulterated labor. Cold, Thomas said. The word dropped into the carriage like a lead weight. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges, entirely unpracticed in polite conversation. Cora blinked, staring at the side of his jaw. A muscle ticked beneath his thick, dark beard. "Pardon," she rasped. Her throat felt as dry as chalk. "The carriage," he muttered, still not looking at her. "Oh, there's a draft. Pull that blanket over your legs." He nodded toward a folded tartan wool blanket on the opposite seat. He didn't reach for it to tuck her in. He didn't play the doting groom. He merely stated a fact and offered a solution. Cora reached out with stiff fingers, pulled the heavy wool over her knees, and retreated back into her rigid posture. The warmth was immediate, trapping the heat against her shivering legs, but it did nothing to thaw the tight knot of ice in her chest. She hated him. She hated his wealth, his calm demeanor, his heavy boots muddying the floorboards. Most of all, she hated her father, who was likely sitting in his smoking room, right now swirling a glass of amber sherry, entirely relieved that the bailiffs wouldn't be breaking his door down tomorrow. The carriage groaned to a halt. The Abernathy estate loomed through the dreary drizzle. It wasn't a manor. There were no sweeping, manicured lawns or marble columns. It was a massive, imposing structure of dark red brick built on a ridge overlooking the screaming teeth of the river mills. It looked exactly like the man who owned it, functional, unyielding, and entirely devoid of charm. A soaked stable boy rushed forward to pull the door open. Thomas stepped out first. The carriage rocked under the sudden absence of his weight. He stood in the ankle-deep mud, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, and turned back. He held out a hand. Cora stared at it. His palm was a map of calluses. She didn't want to touch him. She wanted to shrink into the velvet upholstery and disappear. But she was a realist. She had survived her father's volatile gambling rages. By calculating every move, every silence, every compliant nod. Defiance now would only buy her a bruised cheek or worse. She placed her small, pale, trembling hand into his. His grip was startlingly loose. He didn't pull her. He merely provided a stable anchor as she navigated the treacherous step down. The moment her boots hit the slick cobblestones, he let go. "Mrs. Gable will show you inside," he said, turning toward the sound of the churning water. "I have to check the lower sluice gates. The river is rising." Cora stood in the rain, dumbfounded. He was leaving her at the door, on their wedding day. An older woman with a face like crumpled parchment stood in the heavy oak doorway, holding an oil lamp that cast erratic, jumping shadows against the brick. "Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper." "Well, come on then, girl," the woman barked over the sound of the rain. "Don't stand there catching your death. You're tracking mud as it is." Cora gathered the heavy soaked skirts of her bombazine dress and stepped over the threshold into her new life. The hallway smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. It was dim, practical, and suffocatingly quiet. "He'll be out till dark," Mrs. Gable said, taking Cora's wet cloak with a critical sniff. "Mill doesn't care if a man's just been shackled. Wood needs cutting. Water needs managing. Follow me. I'll show you the quarters." Quarters. The word made her sound like a hired maid. Cora followed the housekeeper up a narrow, creaking staircase. Every step felt like a march toward a scaffold. She was a wife now. Her body no longer belonged to her. When the sun went down, the sluice gates would be secured, the house would lock its doors, and Thomas Abernathy would return to collect his due. She reached the top landing, her breath shallow. The wood paneling seemed to press inward. She could already feel the heavy, inescapable weight of the night to come. Dusk settled over Oakhaven like a suffocating wool blanket. The rain had intensified, drumming violently against the slate roof of the Abernathy house. Inside the cavernous master bedroom, Cora sat on the edge of a massive four-poster bed. She had been sitting there for 3 hours. The room was Spartan, dominated by heavy mahogany furniture and a faded Persian rug that smelled faintly of cedar. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, nervous shadows across the floorboards. She had changed into her nightdress, a thin, white cotton shift her aunt had packed. It offered no warmth and even less dignity. Her stomach gave a pathetic, hollow rumble. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Fear had a way of crowding out hunger, but the long hours of waiting had slowly drained her adrenaline, leaving only a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. A heavy footstep sounded on the stairs. Cora stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the edge of the mattress, her knuckles stark white against the dark quilt. The floorboards in the hallway groaned. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, unhurried. They paused right outside the door. Cora squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't cry," she ordered herself fiercely. "Do not let him see you cry. Disconnect. Go somewhere else." She had perfected the art of going completely blank. When her father threw his whiskey glasses against the wall, she could do this. It was just a transaction, a horrifying, intimate transaction. A solid knock rapped against the heavy wood of the door. Cora jumped. Why was he knocking? It was his house, his room, his wife. "Come in," she managed to say. Her voice was a pathetic squeak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Come in." The brass handle turned. The door swung open, and Thomas filled the doorway. He looked exhausted. His coat was gone, replaced by a damp, collarless linen shirt that clung to his wide chest. The faint smell of wet timber and river mud rolled into the room with him. He held a wooden tray in his left hand. He didn't step fully into the room. He lingered on the threshold, his dark eyes scanning the space before finally settling on her trembling figure at the edge of the bed. For a fraction of a second, something like deep regret flickered across his rough features, but he buried it quickly under his usual stoic mask. "You didn't come down for supper," he said. The gravel in his voice was thick. "I didn't know. I wasn't sure if I was permitted to wander." Cora lied. She had been too paralyzed to leave the room. Thomas looked at the floor, his jaw tightening. He walked in, setting the tray down on a small side table near the fireplace. A bowl of thick mutton stew, a heel of dark bread, and a chipped mug of hot tea. The smell hit Cora's nose, and her stomach betrayed her with another loud, humiliating growl. Thomas stepped back, putting distance between them. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out an object, placing it beside the tray. It landed on the wood with a sharp clack, a heavy brass key. Cora stared at it, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is that?" "The key to this door," Thomas said. He wiped a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than 32. "There's a lock on the inside. I had Miller install it yesterday." Cora's heart did a strange, erratic flutter. She looked from the key to his face, entirely uncomprehending. "I don't understand." "This is your room," Thomas said slowly, as if explaining something to a frightened horse. "My room is down the hall, the one facing the yard. Nobody comes in here unless you turn that key. Not Mrs. Gable, not me." The silence that followed was so absolute Cora could hear the blood rushing in her ears. "You..." She swallowed hard, the cynicism she used as armor warring with sheer shock. "You expect me to lock you out?" "I expect you to eat your dinner before it gets cold," he replied gruffly. "And I expect you to get some sleep." He turned on his heel, his heavy boots sounding loud against the floorboards. "Wait," Cora blurted out. Thomas stopped in the doorway, his back to her. "Why?" The word was torn out of her raw and defensive. Her mind spun wildly. Was there something wrong with her? Was she too thin, too pale? Was this some elaborate psychological cruelty? "My father told me what to expect. The town told me what you are. Why did you buy me if you don't even want to look at me?" Thomas stood perfectly still. The muscles across his broad back tightened under the damp linen. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain lashing the window panes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Your father didn't sell you because he wanted to, Cora. He sold you because the men he owed money to were going to take you as payment. I bought his debts so they couldn't." He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the hard, unyielding line of his profile. "I bought you to keep you out of the gutters, not to put you in my bed." Before she could process the weight of his words, Thomas stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him. A second later, she heard his heavy footsteps receding down the hall. Cora sat frozen. She stared at the brass key gleaming in the firelight. The entire town of Oakhaven believed Thomas Abernathy was a beast who had purchased a plaything. They expected her to appear in town, broken, bruised, a tragic victim of a brute's appetite. Slowly, her bare feet touched the cold floorboards. She walked over to the table, her hands shaking, as she picked up the key. It was heavy, cold, real. She walked to the door, slid the key into the heavy iron lock, and turned it. With a loud, satisfying clack, the bolt slid into place. Cora leaned her forehead against the thick wood of the door, closing her eyes. She wasn't safe. She knew better than to believe she was safe. Men lied. Men played games. But as the smell of the hot stew reached her, wrapping around her in the dim, locked room, Cora realized one terrifying truth. The beast of Oakhaven had just given her the one thing she had never possessed in her entire life, a choice. Morning broke without apology. Pale, watery sunlight dragged itself through the window panes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Cora woke to the relentless, rhythmic thumping of the timber mill. It was a deep, guttural vibration that seeped through the floorboards and settled in her teeth. For 3 days, that sound had been her only companion. She had stayed in the locked room. Every morning, Mrs. Gable left a tray outside the door, knocking sharply once before walking away. Breakfast was porridge and strong, bitter tea. Supper was roasted root vegetables and salted pork. Cora ate sitting on the floor by the hearth, listening to the house. She learned its schedule. Thomas left before dawn. He returned long after the sun dipped below the tree line, his heavy boots sounding on the stairs, before he retreated to his own room. He never knocked on her door. He never lingered in the hallway. The isolation was starting to fray her nerves. Cora was a creature of survival. Her entire existence had been built on reading the moods of volatile men, anticipating the strike before the hand was raised. Here, there was nothing to read. There was no anger, no demands, no drunken slurring. The absence of threat felt like a threat in itself. It was a siege, she decided. He was waiting for her to go mad from the boredom and crawl to him in submission. By the afternoon of the fourth day, the silence in the room became unbearable. Cora stood up, her legs stiff. She had washed her mother's black bombazine dress in the wash basin and pressed it as best she could. With a flat iron Mrs. Gable had grudgingly left by the door, she smoothed the stiff, scratchy fabric over her hips, walked to the door, and grasped the brass key. It turned with a heavy metallic scrape. The hallway was empty. It smelled of lemon oil and old ashes. She stepped out, her soft leather slippers making no sound. The Abernathy house was vast, but it lacked the useless clutter her father had hoarded to feign wealth. There were no imported Chinese vases, no velvet drapes fading in the sun. The walls were paneled in rich, dark walnut, the floors left bare save for thick, woven runners designed to trap mud. It was a house built for utility, not for show. She drifted down the main staircase. As the ground floor was eerily quiet. Mrs. Gable was presumably in the detached kitchen out back. Cora wandered into the front parlor. The furniture was covered in Holland cloths. Clearly, Thomas Abernathy did not entertain. Across the hall lay an open door. Cora approached it cautiously, peering around the doorframe. It was a study. A massive oak desk dominated the center, buried under stacks of invoices, shipping manifests, and leather-bound ledgers. The air in here was different, sharp, with the scent of dried ink, stale tobacco, and pine sap. She stepped inside, unable to stop herself. Her eyes scanned the papers, columns of numbers precise and neat. Lumber exported to the rail yards. Wages paid to men with names like Finch Cole and Brody. There was a ruthless efficiency to the paperwork that made her shiver. This was the mind of the man who had bought her, calculated, precise, leaving nothing to chance. A sudden scrape of boots on the front porch made her freeze. The heavy front door groaned open. Voices spilled into the hallway. "Put it on the slate, Cole." Thomas's rough baritone echoed, vibrating off the bare walls. "If the river rises another inch, we lose the South Dam. Tell the men double wages for the night shift." "Aye, Mr. Abernathy," another voice replied before the door clicked shut. Cora looked around wildly for an escape, but the study had only one exit. She backed away from the desk, pressing her shoulders against the bookshelves, just as Thomas walked in. He stopped dead. He was coated in a fine layer of pale sawdust. It clung to his dark beard, his eyebrows, and the broad shoulders of his wool coat. A smudge of dark machine grease slashed across his left cheekbone. He looked immense in the confined space of the study, smelling heavily of damp earth and raw timber. For a long moment they just stared at each other. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She waited for the reprimand. She had been snooping. Her father would have backhanded her for simply standing near his private papers. Thomas blinked. He reached up, wiping the grease from his cheek, only succeeding in smearing it further into his skin. "You're out," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple observation. "I was—" Cora swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She forced her chin up, masking her terror with a brittle defensive edge. "I was suffocating in that room. If you intend to keep me as a prisoner, you should have barred the windows." Thomas didn't rise to the bait. He walked past her to the desk, giving her the same wide berth he had in the carriage. He pulled off his heavy leather work gloves, tossing them onto a stack of manifests. "You're not a prisoner," he said, pulling out a ledger and flipping it open. He didn't look at her. "Go where you please. The kitchen is out back if you want hot water. Mrs. Gable goes to the market on Tuesdays. You can go with her if you need things." He waved a hand vaguely, clearly uncomfortable with the concept of women's necessities. Cora stared at his broad back. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with repressed frustration. "You bought my father's debt." You brought me here. Why ignore me? Are you trying to humiliate me? Thomas stopped turning the pages. He braced his large hands flat on the desk. The knuckles were split and bleeding sluggishly, the raw edges packed with sawdust. Humiliate you? He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was a deep, weary frustration in his gaze. Cora, I work 14 hours a day trying to keep 300 men employed and a river from swallowing my mills. I don't have the time or the energy to play parlor games with a girl who expects me to act like a monster. The bluntness of his words struck her like a physical blow. I bought the debt so you wouldn't be dragged to a debtor's brothel in London. He continued, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. That's it. There is no trap. There is no scheme. You can live in this house, eat the food, and lock your door every night. But do not stand in my study and accuse me of tormenting you when I have done nothing but leave you in peace. He turned back to his ledger, picking up a pen. Close the door on your way out. The draft scatters the papers. Cora stood rooted to the floor. The cynicism that had kept her alive, the bitter armor she wore to protect herself from the world's cruelty, suddenly felt heavy and useless. She looked at his bleeding knuckles, the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, and realized with a sickening jolt that she had misjudged him entirely. She turned and walked out, her hands trembling. She didn't close the door. She left it open just a crack, letting the warmth of the hallway seep into the cold, ink-stained study. Rain returned on Thursday, sweeping across the valley in violent, icy sheets. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing inward as the storm battered the slate roof. Cora sat at the long dining table, picking at a piece of cold toast. She had abandoned the sanctuary of her bedroom 3 days ago. If she was to be a ghost in this house, she would at least haunt the main floors. Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen furiously, scrubbing copper pots to drown out the thunder. The front of the house was completely silent. Suddenly, the front door burst open, slamming hard against the interior wall. Cora jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. The wind howled through the corridor, carrying the sharp scent of mud, ozone, and something dark and metallic. Mrs. Gable, a voice bellowed. It wasn't Thomas. It was Finch, one of the mill foremen. His voice was cracked with panic. Fetch water and rags. Get the doctor from town. Cora didn't think. She ran into the hallway. Thomas was leaning heavily against the wall, his boots leaving thick, bloody footprints on the floorboards. Finch was supporting his left side, panting hard. Thomas's right arm was clamped tightly over his left shoulder, but dark, wet blood was seeping through his fingers, staining his heavy wool coat a terrifying, slick black. His face was completely drained of color, his skin a sallow, waxy gray beneath the dirt and sawdust. Mrs. Gable went to the root cellar, Cora heard herself say. Her voice sounded unnaturally calm, detaching from the panic swelling in her chest. She can't hear you. Thomas's eyes snapped to her. Even in pain, his gaze was piercing. Go back upstairs, Cora. He gritted his teeth, a harsh breath hissing through them. Finch, get me to the kitchen. He's losing too much blood, ma'am, Finch stuttered, ignoring Thomas. A drive belt snapped, iron buckle whipped right into his shoulder, tore him open bad. Bring him to the parlor, Cora ordered. The absolute authority in her tone surprised all three of them. The kitchen table is covered in Mrs. Gable's baking tins. Put him on the floor in the parlor. Do not put him on the Holland cloths. Finch nodded dumbly, dragging a protesting Thomas into the room. Cora ran. She hiked her heavy black skirts past her knees and sprinted to the kitchen. She grabbed a basin, pumped it full of cold water, and snatched a stack of clean linen dishcloths from the counter. She grabbed the bottle of strong whiskey Mrs. Gable used for fruitcakes. When she returned, Thomas was sitting on the bare floorboards of the parlor, his back against a velvet armchair. Finch had managed to peel the ruined coat off, but the linen shirt underneath was soaked through. Finch, go fetch the doctor, Cora said, dropping to her knees beside Thomas. Take the mare. She's faster in the mud. But, go, she barked. Finch bolted. Cora was left alone with the beast of Oakhaven. The air in the room was thick with the copper smell of blood, and the damp earth clinging to his boots. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. "I told you to go upstairs," he rasped. "And I ignored you," Cora said flatly. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to remain steady as she gripped the torn collar of his shirt. "Move your hand." Thomas opened his eyes. He looked at her truly, looked at her, his dark eyes wide and vulnerable. He slowly pulled his right hand away. The gash was deep, tearing through the heavy muscle just below his collarbone. It was an ugly, jagged wound, pumping dark blood steadily down his chest. Cora didn't flinch. She had stitched up her father's split eyebrows after tavern brawls more times than she could count. She poured a generous splash of whiskey directly onto one of the clean cloths. "This is going to burn," she warned softly. "Do it," he muttered, bracing his head against the armchair. She pressed the alcohol-soaked linen hard against the open wound. Thomas let out a sharp, guttural groan, his entire massive body going rigid. The muscles in his neck strained, the tendons standing out like steel cables. His uninjured hand slammed onto the floorboards, fingers digging into the wood. But he didn't pull away. He didn't curse her. He just endured it. Cora pressed her entire weight into her hands, holding the cloth down to staunch the bleeding. She was kneeling so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could see the dark stubble on his jaw, the deep exhaustion lines bracketing his mouth. Minutes stretched into agonizing silence. The only sounds were the rain lashing the windows and Thomas's harsh, strained breathing. "Why aren't you fainting?" He managed to choke out a bitter, breathless attempt at humor. "Gentlemen's daughters usually faint at the sight of blood." "I haven't been a gentleman's daughter for a very long time," Cora replied quietly. She kept her pressure steady. The blood was slowing no longer, soaking through the top layer of the linen. Thomas opened his eyes again. They were inches from her face, without the armor of his stoicism, without the heavy coat and the distance he usually kept. He looked astonishingly human. "Your father," Thomas breathed his chest, rising and falling heavily beneath her hands. "He owed 1,500 pounds to a man named Silas. No, to a man named Rook. Rook runs the fighting pits in the city. He takes women when men can't pay. He sells them." Cora's breath hitched. She stared down at him. 1,500 pounds. She had assumed it was a few hundred. The sum was staggering. It was the price of a small estate. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, the cynical walls inside her finally beginning to crumble. "You don't know me. I am nothing to you." Thomas reached up with his uninjured hand. His fingers, rough, calloused, and stained with dirt, gently hovered over her wrist. He didn't grab her. He just rested his fingertips against her skin. "You were a girl, sitting in a carriage in a dead woman's dress, waiting for the world to eat you alive." Thomas set his voice, a low, rough rumble that vibrated against her palms. "I know exactly what that feels like, Cora. And I swore a long time ago, if I ever had the power to stop the teeth from closing, I would." Cora stared at him, her vision suddenly blurring. The room, the smell of blood, the sound of the storm. It all faded away, leaving only the heat of his skin and the devastating honesty in his eyes. He hadn't bought a wife. He had staged a rescue entirely, fully aware that she would hate him for it. A hot, treacherous tear spilled over her eyelashes, dropping silently onto his bare chest. Thomas's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had met him, the beast of Oakhaven looked entirely undone. Dr. Harrison smelled of stale peppermint and wet wool. He arrived nearly an hour later, dripping rainwater onto the parlor floorboards, his black bag clutched in a wrinkled hand. Cora stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed tight over her chest, watching as the physician stitched Thomas's torn muscle with thick black silk thread. Thomas didn't make another sound. He sat perfectly rigid against the velvet armchair, his face turned toward the dark window, his jaw locked. The sharp, medicinal sting of carbolic acid cut through the heavy iron smell of blood in the room. Mill machinery, Harrison muttered, snipping the thread with a pair of silver scissors. "It'll be the death of you yet, Abernathy. Keep it clean. No lifting. And for God's sake, stay out of the rain." Thomas gave a curt, single nod. He didn't look at the doctor. He didn't look at Cora. By the time Finch and another worker had half-carried, half-walked Thomas up the narrow stairs to his bedroom, the grandfather clock in the hall was striking midnight. The storm had finally exhausted itself, settling into a dull, rhythmic drizzle against the slate. Cora stood alone in her bedroom. The fire had burned down to glowing orange embers, casting a weak, flickering light across the floor. She walked over to the small side table. The heavy brass key sat exactly where she had left it that morning. She picked it up. The metal was cold against her palm. For 4 nights, this small piece of brass had been her only defense against a terror that didn't actually exist. She turned it over, tracing the jagged teeth with her thumb. "I know exactly what that feels like." His words echoed in the quiet room. The town of Oakhaven saw a hulking, uneducated brute who bought a young wife to satisfy his baser instincts. Her father saw a ledger wiped clean, but sitting on that floor, bleeding out over the floorboards, Thomas had laid bare a truth that unraveled every cynical defense she had spent 16 years building. He had bought her to save her. Cora closed her fist around the key. She turned and walked to the heavy oak door. She didn't lock it. She opened it, stepping out into the drafty hallway. Off it, the floorboards groaned under her soft slippers. She walked past the top of the stairs, stopping in front of the door at the far end of the hall. The room facing the yard. A thin strip of yellow light bled out from beneath the doorframe. Cora didn't knock. She reached out and turned the knob, pushing the door open. The master bedroom was as unadorned as the rest of the house. A massive oak bed, a simple washstand, and a heavy wardrobe. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal and the sharp tang of the doctor's antiseptic salve. Thomas was propped up against a mountain of pillows, his broad chest wrapped tightly in stark white bandages. A single oil lamp burned on the nightstand beside him. He wasn't asleep. He was stubbornly attempting to hold a leather-bound ledger with his one good hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as the door clicked shut behind her. Surprise flashed across his dark eyes, quickly replaced by a cautious, guarded stillness. "I didn't hear you knock," he said. His voice was a raspy whisper, drained of its usual booming authority. "I didn't," Cora replied. She walked across the room. She didn't hover near the door like a frightened animal. She walked straight to the side of the bed, reached out and pulled the heavy ledger out of his hand. Thomas blinked, too weak to stop her. "Finch needs the timber tallies for tomorrow. Finch can count the logs himself," Cora said, dropping the ledger onto the floor with a loud, dismissive thud. She looked down at him. The fever was already starting to set in. A sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his usually pale skin was flushed across the cheekbones. She grabbed a clean cloth from the washstand, dipped it in the basin of cold water, and wrung it out. Without asking permission, she sat down on the very edge of his mattress. The springs groaned under her weight. Thomas stiffened instinctively, trying to pull back, but the sudden movement wrenched his shoulder. He hissed, his eyes squeezing shut. "Stop moving," Cora ordered softly. She pressed the cool, damp cloth against his burning forehead. Thomas let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension slowly draining from his rigid jaw. He opened his eyes, looking up at her from just inches away. "You should be in your room," he murmured. "The door." "The door's unlocked," Cora said. Her voice didn't shake. "And it's going to stay unlocked." Thomas searched her face, the heavy silence stretching between them. "I meant what I said, Cora. I don't expect anything from you. You don't owe me this." "I know," she replied gently, wiping the damp cloth along the rough line of his jaw, clearing away the lingering dust from the mill. "That's exactly why I'm here." She didn't know how to be a wife. She certainly didn't know how to love a man. Her entire life had been a masterclass in survival, in shrinking herself down to avoid the crushing weight of the men who controlled her world. But as she sat in the quiet dark of the Abernathy house, listening to the steady, reassuring thud of Thomas's heartbeat, she realized she no longer needed to survive. She reached into the pocket of her stiff black dress, pulled out the heavy brass key, and set it down on his nightstand. It landed with a soft, final clink against the oil lamp. Thomas looked at the key, then back up at her. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man given to easy expressions. But he reached out with his uninjured hand, his large, rough fingers gently wrapping around her wrist. It wasn't a grip of ownership. It was an anchor. "Get some sleep, Thomas," she whispered, leaning back against the wooden bedpost, pulling her knees up to her chest. She had no intention of leaving the room. "Stubborn Carol," he breathed, closing his eyes. "I'm 16. Cora said, a faint, genuine smirk touching the corner of her lips for the first time in her life. "I have to be." The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the river raged on, violent and unyielding, but inside the dark, quiet room, the beast of Oakhaven finally fell asleep, his calloused hand resting safely against the pulse of the girl who had just locked the rest of the world out. Did Cora's choice surprise you? In a world that traded her like currency, she found power not in escaping the beast, but in truly seeing the man beneath the scars. Sometimes the darkest rumors hide the most fiercely protective hearts. If this raw, slow-burn historical romance pulled you in, please hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a deeply grounded story. Subscribe to the channel for more immersive audio dramas and let us know your favorite moment in the comments below.